Well, good morning. I'm Ken Biberaj, and welcome to Coffee with Ken, a thought leadership series at the nexus of business and politics. In the news today, the Screen Actors Guild is expected to go on strike, putting Hollywood in a precarious position, and inflation appears to be easing and fell to the lowest rate in 2 years. Today's topic is losing my mind. No one better than Andy Dunn, the author of Burn Rate, to come on today and talk to us. What does that even mean? What you've been through, Andy? I mean, I'm wearing my Bonobos shirt and pants, like I'm ready for this conversation. So why don't we start with how are you? Where are you? How's life?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm in Chicago. Moved here from New York City a couple years ago and settling in. And then we spent some time in Rio de Janeiro, where my wife is from, escaping the Chicago winter. And I spent the last couple of years doing a few things, one of which was writing this book, this memoir, Burn Rate. And it basically talks about all the ways the entrepreneurial highs and lows intersected with an underlying mood disorder, bipolar 1, that I had kept in the closet for about 2 decades. And so I thought, Burn Rate was a chance to share, the real story behind the living the dream myth of what the entrepreneurial roller coaster was like for me on both dimensions.
Wow. I mean, I feel like there's almost like a two-part conversation, right? Like on one hand is like you as entrepreneur building, having done what you did with Bonobos, and even wanting to hear about what you're up to now, and then also just like the mental health aspect of this, and kind of I think your approach about just like we need to be transparent, we need to talk about it. It looks like it's on your coffee cup, right? I think like cheers. I mean, at every
Cheers.
change
Whoa,
we
I want
get,
a coffee. I want a coffee with Ken mug. Wait a
deal,
second.
we'll trade. It's coming in the mail. So just to kind of like level set for folks, let's just start with Bonobos. Like, let's talk about your entrepreneurial spirit. Like, you know, you're at Stanford. Give us the origin story. Like, how did it come about? What were you dealing with behind the scenes? But also just kind of what was that rocket ship like for, the better part of 10, 15 years for you?
Yeah, I had a friend, a colleague and eventual co-founder, Brian Spaley, who felt like men's pants didn't fit. He grew up playing hockey and soccer in the Midwest, grew up what he called hockey butt with hockey butt. And so he was this genius who built a better fitting pair of men's pants. And I was looking at everything happening in the world and I thought, okay, maybe there's a chance we can just build this brand digitally from the ground up.
Mhm.
Brian thought that was a great idea. We teamed up, and at the time it was pretty contrarian, selling an e-commerce brand online that had no awareness. This was pre the launch of Facebook's advertising platform. Instagram didn't exist. Obviously, TikTok a decade out. Shopify had been founded, but no one knew about it yet. So it was a contrarian idea at the time, and we were really lucky that we got it right. It took a while to build the business, but that was kind of the origin story. Pants over the internet.
I mean, but also like fit and mailed, right? Like you didn't even have the kind of like even with retail, I feel like you were kind of innovating and taking retail in a totally different direction, which today is like table stakes, right? Like without the warehousing and the back of the house and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think in a way we've come like full circle because the best D2C businesses now, direct to consumer, I think are
Yeah.
ones that are unlocking kind of the whole omni-channel thing. Like my sister's brand, Monica and Andy, which is baby apparel. Our Walmart business and our digital business are equally important to us. And I think at Bonobos, we figured that out over time. It took us a minute where we did a partnership with Nordstrom. We opened these fit to ship stores. So I don't think that digital only is the way to go. And maybe
Sure.
if we talked 15 years ago, I would have been like, stores are dead. It's
Yeah.
the internet to the moon. I think it is a blend, but I'm really proud that our team helped kind of chart the digitally native path.
Got it. And so just like the rapid acceleration, right? Like you went to, small founding team to what, 500 people, 150 locations, selling to Walmart, right? Like tell us about the kind of tail end there. Like what was that like as the exit and where the brand had come to that point?
Yeah, I mean, by the time we got to 2017, we'd been in business for a decade. We'd sold, I don't know, a couple million pairs
Million.
of pants, 100 million in capital raised. And I remember sitting down with Doug McMillon, the CEO of Walmart, who they went on to acquire the business. And he was like, why do you want to do this? And I just said, I need a job.
I
Feel
love it.
like being a founder and a CEO, it's a job, but it's not a stable job. And I
Yeah.
think it ties in a little bit with the book where you get to a point where it feels like the company is ready for the next era.
Yeah.
And we had three paths that we could go. We could have gone a strategic route, which we ended up doing. There was a path to staying independent and going IPO, or there was a private equity option.
Mm.
And I felt like, retail's difficult. Let's
Sure.
put the brand inside of a big, safe tent. And then we got a front row seat to see like the Walmart and Amazon, battle play out. And it was really cool to be a part of that for a
Oh,
period of
it's
time.
amazing. And now you're fully out and you're on to new ventures, right?
Well, it's interesting. So, on to new ventures. And then, of course, Walmart recently divested Bonobos, and a friend of mine bought it with via his
Amazing.
firm, WHP Global. So he brought me back on as an advisor. It's kind of
Full
like
circle.
it's kind of like a board role. So yeah, it's full
Oh
circle.
my God, that's amazing. Well, look, let's talk a little bit about the book, right? I mean, like, I knew from New York. I feel like I was there from '05 to 17, and it was kind of like the Bonobos era, right? It was like this heyday of, I think, our generation where so much happened with e-commerce and innovation, and New York was in such a special place then. But
Yeah.
behind the scenes, I mean, I loved your TED Talk. I loved reading the book, but
Thanks,
like,
man.
what was happening behind the scenes, right? Like, I mean, tell everybody about like your own challenges on the mental health side. I mean, you previously had issues when you were younger, and how you had to kind of like hide those, it felt like. And, what
Yeah.
was the journey like?
Yeah. So when I was a senior in college, I had what's called a manic episode, which is it's basically a psychotic break, typically delusions of grandeur, racing speech, flight of ideas, lack of sleep. In my case, I was up for about 100 hours in a row. And I ended up hospitalized at the hospital where my mom worked and where I had worked part time in the psychiatric ward. And after a week there, through medication and great care, came back down to earth. And on discharge, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1. And I had no idea what that meant. It sounded terrible. And spent the next 6 months finding a way to bury the diagnosis,
Mm.
pretend that the event had not happened, and instead kind of blame, quote unquote, blame the whole episode on having taken psilocybin mushrooms a couple weeks earlier. And while
Uh,
it's true that drugs and bipolar or other mental illnesses can intersect, the presence of one doesn't mean that the other one, wasn't a factor as well. And so, Ken, I spent, 16 years in denial of the fact that I'd had this episode, that it had resulted in this diagnosis, that it had these implications, which is that the mania could recur,
yeah.
and it was also likely that I would go through some periods of difficult or maybe even severe depression.
Mm.
And I had an 8-year era where I had neither of those. I had none of the really high highs and none of the low lows. So it enabled this sort of fantasy that it hadn't happened to continue. And then fast forward to that era you described in New York,
Yeah.
the go-go days of Bonobos, and I started going through some really bad depression.
Mhm.
Didn't want to get out of bed, didn't want to walk up Sixth Avenue to work, didn't want to live. I'd kind of get out of it, pull out of it, kind of grind through it, and then hit these phases of what's called hypomania.
Mm.
And hypomania is kind of like mania, but minus the psychosis. So you can
Interesting.
actually be like eminently cogent during hypomania, but you have so much energy,
Mm.
decreased need for sleep, burning the candle at both ends. And that tends to be a mood state well suited, for better for worse, to entrepreneurship. So if you think about like our first 3 years, there was no institutional venture capital interested in
Sure.
Bonobos. Raised $8 million from over 100 people. A lot of that was fueled by a hypomanic energy for fundraising, for meeting new
Sure.
people. And so that line between hypomania and entrepreneurial zeal is a very fine one to try to
Yeah.
parse. So what ended up happening is, rather than looking back and saying, wait, I had this diagnosis when I was 20, I'm showing up in ways that would suggest I do have bipolar disorder. The illness was cloaked inside of the job,
Mm.
because the job, it was expected almost
Yeah.
that entrepreneurship was a roller coaster. I remained in
And it's
denial of it.
literally called a roller coaster,
It
which tracks
is.
your mental health mood swings, right? Which that kind of is such a unique way to think about it too.
Yeah. So it wasn't until 2016 when I had my second full-blown episode of mania, ended up Bellevue Hospital for a week, horrifying incident, ended up in jail afterwards. I guess
Mm.
you'll have to read the book if you want to learn more, and I know you have, Ken. That kind of brought everything to a head, and that
Wow.
was kind of the reckoning of, okay, this has been bipolar the entire time.
Yeah.
Now what am I going to do about it to get healthy and to be able to be healthy on behalf of everyone that I love and everything that I love?
So thinking of like founders, and I know a lot of founders like you who are just high energy and kind of bring this approach. There was a line in your book that I loved. One of the lessons you learned later on was an elevated mood state can be just even more dangerous than a depressive one. Like, talk about that, right? Like you feel like you're on the high. So like what could possibly be going wrong? And you need that energy to close $8 million rounds and take this global, right? I mean,
Yeah. Well, hypomania has a lot of these positive attributes that I described, but there are some other ones, right? There can be bad judgment, risk taking, both personally or professional, that goes off the rails. I can remember at Bonobos dreaming that we were going to build great software for the entire e-commerce industry inside of our pants company.
wow.
And, we opened an office in Palo Alto and we spent millions of dollars and we tried to write software and we ended up with a culture conflict inside the company between our New York team that were like, hey, we sell menswear, and our West Coast team that was like, we're writing software to power the e-commerce, revolution. And of course, Shopify ended up doing that. And it makes sense that there was a company that would do that, that was founded by a computer scientist, and that's all that they would be focused on. And so you have this fine line between fantasy and reality when it comes to startups. And hypomania, you walk right on that line. And so there are some benefits to it, but there are some costs as well. And the ultimate cost is if that hypomania slides up for someone with bipolar one like me into mania, which
Mm,
is, at that point, anything can happen because it's a state of psychosis. It's literally that
yeah.
subtitle of the book. You've lost your mind once you're in a manic state.
Yeah. So we don't, as a country, really talk a lot about this, right? And I think in your TED talk, you made a really interesting point where you said when we refer to, cancer, let's say, where you say someone has cancer, it's not someone is cancer, right? And if you're talking to somebody's like they are crazy or something like that, right? Like the verbiage, how we think about this stuff, right? Like what take us how you think we should be discussing this.
Yeah, well, bipolar is the example that you're referring to, which
Yeah.
is we tend to say Andy is bipolar. And it's like, no, no, no. Like if I had cancer, we wouldn't say Andy is cancer. We would say Andy has it, right? And so we need to separate the identity from the illness, because right now it feels, for me, having gone through it, almost like when you get diagnosed with a mental health condition, you are somehow permanently stained. It's
Mm,
something that might be talked about in hushed tones.
sure.
You're different, you're untrustworthy, you are disorderly. And I think we need to move and pull apart and say, no, that it's just like having something that's a physical ailment.
Mhm.
It's something that you have to deal with. It's an illness or a condition of the brain, which is just another one of the body's organs. Arguably, one of the most important two or three organs, or I don't know what the list is, which means that we can't afford to stigmatize these issues. We just have to go deal with them. And so that's the mission that I'm on, is let's normalize disclosure of mental health and mental health conditions in the workplace,
Mhm.
because actually the workplace it can be a frontier for that type of disclosure that is, sometimes even harder amongst family and friends. And
And
yeah,
that's not happening today, really, right? I mean, like, I think there is
I,
this movement post COVID where I think mental health is now something where we're all very attuned to and folks are paying more attention to. But like, what's your advice to business leaders, to corporations, to leaders in government? How should we be pushing folks to think about this?
I think it's on the move. I mean, I
Yeah.
feel so optimistic about it. I think the conversation is changing. I think it's been pushed in sports. It's always been a conversation in entertainment. And I think
Yeah.
the business community is is making strides. And I think that comes in three steps. The first is disclosure.
Mm,
And I encourage all founders and CEOs to take the first step by at some point sharing with your teams something difficult that you faced.
mm,
I try to say, like, it doesn't take an acute mental health condition to have been through a mental health crisis.
mm,
No one makes it to the age of 40 without some kind of mental health crisis, the loss of a loved one, financial stress, physical health issues are mental health challenges, the mental health challenges or physical health challenges of our family members, a new job, a move. All of these things can create mental health challenges. And so leaders can disclose, hey, I'm going through a tough time right now. Here's what's going on. Or here's something that's happening in my family, or here's something that's happened to me. And it changes the whole culture. The moment a leader of an organization shows up with that kind of vulnerability, it's the beginning of creating a safe space for everyone to bring their true selves to work. So I think that step one is disclosure. Step two is treatment. And I think there, what we need to do is mental health stuff is just not reimbursed. It's not reimbursed at a high enough rate. my psychiatrist, for example, 9% reimbursement,
Hmm.
which means that if it weren't for the fact that I've sold a lot of pants at one point, I wouldn't be able to afford the care that I
Yeah.
need for the condition. And so what I'm seeing some enterprising companies do is offer a stipend. I do it at my new startup above and beyond typical reimbursement
Mhm.
for licensed clinicians for mental health. And I think eventually we need a mental health insurance product on par with what we do for dental insurance or vision insurance, right? Let's take care of our teeth and our eyes, but
Yeah.
as for our brains, seems like it should be on the list, right? And then thirdly,
Absolutely.
just building community around it. And I think community can be if it's a large corporation, it can be actually having a neurodiversity employee resource group. But if not, it's finding other ways to create a safe space for people to talk about it. Could be a book club, it could be other conversations that are
Yeah.
facilitated where mental health is on the table, and say like, look, this isn't a big deal, but
Mhm.
it's a really big deal if we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
It's a really big deal if we have a colleague who's prone to depression, who doesn't feel comfortable sharing that. Because all of a
Mhm.
sudden, then Ken, it's like, well, where's Andy today? He's out again. That's a very different concept if,
Yeah.
oh, he might be sick versus he's mailing it in.
Yeah.
And that's where we need to make sure that people can disclose this stuff
Mhm.
before a crisis.
Yeah, because you went through this, right? I mean, like up until 2016, right? Like you weren't really disclosing it or acknowledging it, right? Like I'm sure you kind of had, based on the book, like your own defensive kind of guard up, like, right? I mean, so like at what point did you feel really comfortable kind of being, more public about it? And you seem to have had an amazing network with family and a board that relied on you and so on. I mean, so talk a little bit about your safety net, how it gave you comfort, and then how others can kind of, get comfortable enough to disclose, right? Just back to step one.
Yeah, I wasn't comfortable at all, partly because I wasn't even having the dialogue with myself.
Sure.
And so one of the ironies of when I finally did start telling folks, by the way, I started telling folks not because I was courageous, but because I had to, coming out of this hospitalization where I'd been arrested. But the funniest part about it, Ken, is I would tell folks, hey, I have this condition, people that worked with me for years, and then be like, oh, I see.
Now I get
Oh, oh,
you.
really? You have mood swings? So it's one of these things where it's not true for all mental health conditions, but often our friends and loved ones and our colleagues, they know intuitively, even if they don't have a name for it.
Yeah.
And it's actually a relief when there's a name for it. It's a relief when we know that a person who's dealing with something is in touch with it. And what's really a relief is when we know that they're dealing with it,
Mm.
right? When I got to come to my board and say, hey, I went through this. I don't know if you want to back me, but here's what I'm doing and here's my plan. I'm seeing a
Mm.
doctor 2 to 3 times a week. I take medication every day. I haven't missed a day of medication in 7 years. I haven't missed a night of sending a sleep report to my psychiatrist and my wife and my mom and my sister in 7 years. So the cool thing is that once the conversation is in the open, we can now be accountable to getting better, right? If we don't feel like there's something shameful about it, okay, cool. Now we just deal with it the same way that you would with a physical condition.
Mm.
Get a headache, take Tylenol,
Yeah.
right? Tear your ACL, get surgery. Have bipolar 1, take medication and see a
Yeah.
doctor. These shouldn't be different concepts. It's
Yeah.
the same concept, taking care of yourself.
Mhm. But I think you alluded to this earlier, right? Like you're personally in a unique position to be able to kind of afford some of these things or be ahead of the curve to have it, right? It just strikes me as when it comes to mental health, like what a gap we probably have in this country with folks who, aren't able to diagnose themselves, don't have access to resources or care and so on, right? Because you can't reimburse it. Like, how do you think through like the broader macro kind of like, and I guess this is so much of what you're doing to raise awareness, but like how big is that gap, right? Of like the have and have nots who can actually treat themselves.
The gap's massive. And I think there's a reason to be optimistic. And the
Mm.
reason is that I think we can reframe mental health care as a profit center rather than a cost center.
Interesting.
And I think this is critical, right?
Mm.
If it's, hey, let's do this because it's the right thing to do, let's add this cost to our P&L, that's not a winning argument.
Yeah.
But let's do this because we're going to get a higher productivity workforce. That's going to
Retention,
we're going
recruitment.
to
Yeah.
increase revenue per employee. to your point, we're going to increase employee retention. We're going to decrease turnover. We're going to create more esprit de corps and camaraderie because there's going to be a more mentally fit group of people working together. Reframing it as mental fitness, then I think it becomes an investment that winning companies are making. And those winning companies have more winning cultures. And it becomes something where you need to do it to keep up
Yeah.
rather than you have to do it for some other societal norm. I think
Interesting.
that's the reframing that we can make. And I think it's going to bear fruit. I think it's going to be true.
That's great. Now, tell us a little bit about the reaction from your TED Talk, from the book, right? Like, have you been hearing from other founders and entrepreneurs? Like, what's the reaction been like for you personally? Like, you put yourself out
Yeah.
there, right? You put this in a very public way. Like, I'm just so curious. Like,
It's
how
funny.
do you feel?
The week before the book came out, I was talking to a close friend of mine, and he said, Andy, you got to be prepared here. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, not everyone is going to have a positive reaction to this. Social media, some people are going to be nasty, so on and so forth. There's been 3 mean tweets. That's it. And of course, I read them. Um, it is shocking how ready we are for these kinds of stories because everyone knows on some level that life is hard. Everyone's fighting a battle that we don't know about. And so the other joke that I make to people is one of my other learnings is nobody cares about you in the best possible way. No one is sitting here thinking, let me just really spend time thinking about Ken's mental health tonight. How's Ken doing? What's Ken wrestling with? And so if you came
Why
forward,
does he drink so much coffee? Like,
yeah,
why?
like, is Ken okay? I've seen him drink so much coffee. So it's this thing where we almost have a perverted narcissism when it comes to things like this. Like, if people know that I have this issue, it's somehow going to dramatically affect their day. It's not. All people want to know is, are you okay? Right. And to the extent that they work with you, are you competent? Are you able to do your job? And so if you look at bipolar, and this is so important, bipolar, we think, is 2% of the general population, 11% of entrepreneurs. So it indexes 5 to 1. And so I joke with entrepreneurs now, if you have bipolar, you're 5 times as likely to be successful. And by the way, that's probably true.
Yeah.
It's probably true, but not if you don't keep it in check, not if you don't contain it.
Yeah.
And so it's been a beautiful thing to put this story out there because I realized I held this thing that I was so ashamed of. And it turns out that once I flipped it and said, no, there's nothing to be ashamed of. Here's the story. It wasn't, it wasn't a big deal to other people in the way that I thought it would be. It was a big deal to people in the way that I could never dreamed it would be, which is opening up all these other stories, seeing that this is a universal issue. There's not a family that's untouched by some story of severe mental illness, and there's not a human that is untouched at some point by an acute mental health challenge.
So let's talk about community just for a second. So, like, advocates, friends, coworkers, like, how should people be thinking about it to actually, like, be aware of their family members and colleagues? Right? Like, how are you an ally? How are you an advocate? Like, what should people be thinking about? Is it just like a pause and maybe you should think about Andy a little bit every day, or like, how does that work? Because I think if something happens to somebody, maybe you do stand off a little bit. You're like, oh, something's going on with him. Maybe I'll, like,
It's a great example.
yeah.
So luckily someone worked on this. So Lady Gaga and the Born This Way Foundation endowed a Canadian not-for-profit called jack.org to create something called the Being There certificate. And the Being There certificate, I recommend it to every human. Every human. It's a 30-minute training on how to approach conversations about mental health. And so I'll give you a great example because you raised it. Let's say I notice, Ken, that doesn't seem like you're doing great. There is a norm, which is I shouldn't bring it up unless you bring it up. The Being There certificate trains you on something very different. Once you see behavior that you're concerned about for 2 weeks, you are now obliged to check in. And the check-in looks like this. Okay, Ken, just checking in. I noticed you haven't had your usual, joie de vivre the last couple weeks. Or maybe it's, normally you're here at 7 a.m. drinking coffee and I haven't seen you, before noon. Just wanted to see how you're doing, and that's the check-in. That's one example of things that we typically get wrong, not bringing it up, right? When we hear from people who have gone through severe depression, they were literally dying for someone to see that someone else cared, right? Another one would be, let's say I come to you, Ken, and I say, hey, Ken, I wanted to tell you something. I've got this condition, bipolar one. One thing that might be common in that scenario is to say, like, oh, my mom has bipolar. And it turns out that's not the right moment for it, right? It's not the right moment to shift the spotlight away. There can be false equivalencies. You just want to stay with that person and deploy something that we all have, which is empathy. Listen, learn more, ask some questions, and then figure out how to be helpful and how to be a resource. So I love the Being There certificate,
Right.
video-based training, walking anyone through how to approach being an ally, an advocate, a friend.
That's amazing. Well, look, as we wind down, one of the last things we kind of caught up about when I saw you in person in New York was politics,
Yeah.
right? And I think you talk a little bit, not enough, frankly. I think you should talk a little bit more about political aspirations in your book, right? Because it was something I think you gave serious thought to. But talk a little bit about that. Like, you had interest in government and public service. How do you think about it? What role should government be playing in these topics, right? Like, I kind of feel like your desire and mission back then to serve
Yeah.
kind of maybe missed the timing versus today, where it's like you have a very clear kind of voice and message on something that's super important, right, Andy? So, like, I don't know, just talk a little bit about how you think about
Well,
public service and government. Not that you're going to run again, but like, what are you thinking, man?
no, I mean, now I've got a 2.5-year-old, and my mom jokes, why don't you prove you can be like the mayor of your house before you try to run for mayor of a city or something? My sense of civic duty has moved to creating one great informed citizen, and who knows down the road. But it's funny how having our son has shifted my perspective on how I want to spend my nights and weekends. Um, Mental health, from a politics standpoint, we're in a really cool spot
Yeah.
because it's actually a bipartisan consensus
Mhm.
that we need to do something about it. So it's not stuck in the divisiveness. And the best example of this is both New York State and North Carolina have billion-dollar legislation around mental health that's been put on the table. And if you've got states at the moment as politically disparate as North Carolina and New York, both getting behind billion-dollar bills, that shows you that this is a bipartisan issue. So I think we can make a lot of progress on mental health over the course of the next 5 years, both at the federal level, state, and local, because this conversation is happening.
And
And
are you looking to be more active in that conversation? Like, do you spend some time kind of proactively trying to get out there and talk to policymakers? Are you thinking about that maybe for the future? Or
the book for me was kind of like,
that was your
let
way?
me tell my story. And now my biggest project is I'm working on a new company that the goal of the company is to address the social isolation epidemic. So
So
we
tell
now
us about
spend,
that as we close out. Go.
yeah,
What's
so we now spend 20 fewer hours per month with other humans than we did in 2003. 20 fewer hours per month. And so the goal, the company's called Pi, is to increase social opportunities for everyone. And the idea is that if we can offer everyone 2 more chances to do something socially per week, we can help reverse that trend. And so more to come on that when we hopefully will launch it in a bigger way later in the year.
Well, I mean, it's kind of terrible to say, but your timing, as always, it seems to be pretty spot on. I mean, the Surgeon General has called social isolation an epidemic. I
Yeah,
mean, I think the timing of what you're trying to do really coincides with a true public health kind of concern. So it's amazing.
better to be
Well,
lucky than good, I guess.
hey, listen, Andy, it's always wonderful to see you. Congratulations on the book.
Thanks
Thanks for
again.
being here today. Appreciate everyone tuning in. As always, you can follow us on coffeewithken.com. We're on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Google Play. Our next topic next week is going to be recycling the unrecyclable. So we look forward to that. And again, Andy, thanks so much.
Thanks, Ken. Take care of your mental health, everyone. All
Yeah.
right. See ya.